The question hit Betty Williams like a punch to the chest. Standing at the Family Feud podium, in her best Sunday dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that Harold had always said, brought out her eyes. She felt 72 years of memories rushing through her mind all at once. 6 months. It had only been 6 months since she'd held his hand as he took his last breath, and the world still felt impossibly empty without him. "What do you miss most?" Steve Harvey had asked, and those 4 simple words opened a floodgate of grief that Betty had been holding back since the funeral. It was Tuesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta, and the Williams family had made the journey from small-town Georgia in Harold's old pickup truck. The same faded blue Ford that still smelled like his Old Spice cologne, and the peppermint candies he kept in the glove compartment. Betty sat in the passenger seat, where she'd spent countless Saturday mornings, her hand automatically reaching for his on the gear shift, before remembering he wasn't there anymore. The Williams family was exactly what you'd expect from rural Georgia. Warm, tight-knit, and full of the kind of love that had sustained them through decades of simple living and honest work. Betty's daughter Carol, 45, a nurse at the county hospital, had organized the Family Feud application as a desperate attempt to get her mother out of the house, where she'd been slowly disappearing since the funeral. Her son-in-law Mike was gentle and supportive, a mechanic who'd loved Harold like a father. The grandchildren, Emma, 16, and twins Jake and Josh, 14, had been excited about being on television, but mostly they just wanted to see their grandmother smile a real smile again. What the audience didn't know was that Betty had been living in a world of silence for 6 months. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the terrible, echoing silence that fills a house when the person who made it feel like home suddenly isn't there anymore. The silence of eating dinner alone after 50 years of sharing every meal. The silence of watching television without Harold's running commentary. The silence of Saturday nights without music. During family introductions, Steve had been charmed by Betty's quiet dignity and the obvious love this family shared. There was something about the way Carol's hand stayed close to her mother's shoulder, ready to offer support. Something about the way Mike's gentle humor seemed perfectly calibrated to bring out Betty's shy smile. Something about the way the grandchildren included her in every joke with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from deep love. "Mrs. Betty," Steve had said, "tell me about your family. Y'all seem really close." "We are," Betty had replied with her soft Georgia drawl. "Family's everything. My Harold always said that family and faith are the only things that matter in this world." Steve had noticed the past tense immediately. "Harold was your husband?" 50 years, Betty had said, her composure wavering. 50 wonderful years. He passed 6 months ago. The studio had grown quieter, the audience sensing the weight of those words. Steve, who had learned over decades of hosting to read the stories written in people's faces, had seen something in Betty's eyes that went beyond ordinary grief. This was the look of someone who had lost not just a spouse, but the entire framework around which she built her understanding of herself and the world. The game had progressed through 4 rounds, with the Williams family holding their own against the Martinez family from Phoenix. But Betty's participation had felt effortful, like someone going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. Carol and Mike had carried much of the load, their answers quick and confident, while Betty had contributed when called upon, but seemed to be operating from muscle memory rather than genuine engagement. Now, in the final round, with everything on the line, Steve was asking the question that would force Betty to confront the vast emptiness Harold's death had left behind. "Mrs. Betty," Steve said gently, "for 37 points and the win, what do you miss most?" The studio buzzed with familiar energy. The Williams family needed this answer to secure victory and take home $20,000 that would help with medical bills and funeral expenses. They were still paying off. This should have been straightforward. Betty could have said his voice, or his laugh, or his hugs. Any simple answer about missing a deceased spouse would likely be on the board. But Betty stood paralyzed at that podium, her mind not on the game, but on the impossible vastness of loss. How do you quantify what you miss most? about someone who was woven into every single thread of your daily existence. 6 months of waking up in a bed that felt too big, of cooking for one when she'd spent 50 years cooking for two, of sitting in a living room where Harold's chair remained exactly as he'd left it, still bearing the impression of his body. "Mrs. Betty," Steve prompted gently, stepping closer to the podium. He could see the tears forming in her eyes, could sense that this question had touched something deeper than he'd intended. Betty looked at her family lined up at their podium. Carol, watching with the careful attention of a daughter, who'd been monitoring her mother's emotional weather for months. Mike with his steady presence, and the grandchildren with their young faces, serious with the weight of wanting to help carry a burden they couldn't fully comprehend. "Dancing with my husband," Betty said, and her voice broke on the word dancing as if saying it out loud made Harold's absence even more real. The studio fell completely silent. This wasn't the polite quiet that comes during game show suspense. This was the profound silence that emerges when 300 strangers suddenly understand they're witnessing something sacred. Steve's expression changed immediately. In 40 years of hosting, he'd heard thousands of answers, but something about the way Betty said dancing with such longing, such pure heartbreak, cut straight through every defense he'd built around his own emotions. "Tell me about that," Steve said, abandoning his position and walking closer to Betty. The game could wait. This was about something more important than points on a board. Betty reached into the small black purse she'd carried for 20 years, the one Harold had bought her after noticing that her old one was falling apart, and pulled out a tissue. She dabbed at her eyes before speaking, gathering herself for what felt like the most important story she'd ever told. "Harold wasn't much of a dancer when we first met," she said, her voice growing stronger as she remembered. "He was shy, you know, thought he had 2 left feet. But every Saturday night, we'd listen to the radio while I did the dishes, and he'd come up behind me and ask for a dance." The audience was completely still, hanging on every word. Right there in our little kitchen, between the sink and the icebox, we'd dance to whatever song was playing. Sometimes it was Patsy Cline, sometimes it was Elvis, sometimes just the local weather report. A small smile crossed Betty's face for the first time since she'd stepped onto the stage. Didn't matter what was playing, Harold would take my hands, pull me close, and we'd sway back and forth like we were the only 2 people in the world. Steve found himself fighting back tears. This wasn't just about missing a husband. This was about missing a ritual, a connection, a way of being in the world that had defined Betty's life for half a century. "How often did you dance?" Steve asked. "Every Saturday night for 50 years, Betty said, and the mathematical precision of that statement, 2,600 Saturday night dances, hung in the air like a testament to devotion. Even when he got sick, even when the cancer made him so weak he could barely stand, he'd still ask me to dance. The night before he went to the hospital for the last time, he held my hands and we swayed to Bing Crosby, singing, 'I'll Be Loving You Always.' It was our wedding song." The cameras caught the tears streaming down, not just Betty's face, but the faces of audience members who were remembering their own lost loves, their own sacred rituals, their own last dances. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that would define this moment forever. "Mrs. Betty," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you honor me with a dance?" Betty looked up at him in surprise. "Here, now?" "Right here, right now," Steve said, extending his hand with the same gentleness she'd described Harold showing all those Saturday nights. "Because you're right, dancing with someone you love is something worth missing. And if Harold can't be here to dance with you, then I'd like to stand in for him, just this once." Without waiting for her answer, Steve gestured to the production booth. "Can we get some music in here? Something slow and sweet." The studio speakers crackled to life with a gentle instrumental version of "The Way You Look Tonight." Not the original Sinatra version, but a simple, sweet rendition that filled the space with warmth and possibility. Steve extended his hand to Betty again, and after a moment's hesitation, the kind of pause that comes from 50 years of dancing with only one person, she placed her small weathered hand in his. Right there on the Family Feud stage, In front of 300 strangers and millions of viewers, Betty Williams began to dance again for the first time since Harold died. It wasn't elegant or polished. Steve was careful and protective, supporting Betty's slight frame as they swayed slowly in the center of the stage. But for those 3 minutes, Betty wasn't a widow competing on a game show. She was a woman remembering what it felt like to be held, to move in rhythm with another person, to feel less alone in the world. The audience watched in complete silence, understanding they were witnessing something profound. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was healing. This was love extending itself beyond death, beyond loss, beyond the terrible loneliness that grief can bring. When the music ended, Steve held Betty's hands and looked directly into her eyes. "How did that feel?" he asked, like Harold was watching. Betty said, tears streaming down her face, but smiling for the first time in months, like he was right here with us. "I think he was," Steve said simply. "I think love like yours doesn't end just because someone's not physically here anymore. I think it finds ways to keep dancing." The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual game show celebration. It was recognition of something beautiful, something that transcended entertainment and touched the universal human experience of love and loss. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the weight of what had just happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, "Mrs. Betty just reminded us of something important. Love doesn't die when people do. It lives on in the memories we carry, in the rituals we shared, in the dances we remember." He turned back to Betty, taking her hands again with the same gentleness Harold had shown for 50 years. "Mrs. Betty, I want you to know something. Tonight, when you go home to that house that feels too quiet, I want you to put on some music. I want you to stand in that kitchen where you and Harold used to dance. And I want you to move, because he's not gone. He's just dancing where you can't see him yet." As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something beautiful unfolded. People approached Betty, not with pity, but with their own stories of love and loss. Women shared memories of their own last dances. Men talked about the small rituals that had defined their marriages. Children, who'd lost grandparents, spoke about the way certain melodies could bring back the feeling of being completely loved. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came from Betty's granddaughter Emma, who had watched her grandmother transform from a woman drowning in grief into someone who remembered how to move with joy. "Grandma," Emma said, hugging her tightly, "can you teach me to dance like that, the way you danced with Grandpa?" Betty smiled through her tears. "Of course, sweetheart. Love should always keep dancing." 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to remove Steve's unprecedented decision to dance with a grieving widow on national television. The response was unlike anything in game show history. Thousands of viewers reached out to share their own stories of love, loss, and the small rituals that keep memories alive. Betty's dance sparked conversations in homes across America about cherishing the time we have, about the importance of small gestures, about how love expresses itself in the ordinary moments of daily life. Steve's foundation partnered with senior centers and grief counseling organizations to create programs that helped widows and widowers rebuild social connections and rediscover joy after loss. The Betty Williams Dance Initiative began offering free dance classes for people learning to move through life after devastating loss. But the most important change was in Betty's life. She started dancing again, not just in her memory, but in her body. She joined a senior dance group at her church, where other widows and widowers came together to move, to remember, and to discover that love could take new forms even after loss. Betty still dances in her kitchen every Saturday night, just like she did with Harold. But now she also dances at her granddaughter's school events, at family gatherings, and at community functions where other people need to remember that it's possible to move forward while still honoring what came before. The question that broke Betty's heart, "What do you miss most?" became the question that helped her heal. Because sometimes the most painful truths are also the most beautiful ones. And sometimes the best way to honor what we've lost is to keep dancing, even when we're dancing alone. The widow's last dance wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. A reminder that love is movement, that grief can coexist with joy, and that sometimes the most healing thing we can do is take someone's hand and help them remember how it feels to sway to music, to be held, to move through the world with grace, even when our hearts are broken, because love doesn't end when the music stops. It just waits for someone to turn the volume back up and invite it to dance again.